Okay. So on to the actual lecture. Okay, let's learn a little bit about the history of psychology. So psychology is, like I kind of emphasized a little bit in going over the syllabus, it's the science of behavior and mental processes. Okay? It's not Sigmund Freud. It's not really any of this craziness. So big emphasis on the science. And what do we mean by science? Well, stuff that we can test, stuff that we can empirically observe. Psychology goes back a long way, even to Aristotle, who theorized about a lot of different psychological concepts. And this was, some of them were kind of wacky, but were interesting. But psychology didn't really begin, in my opinion, until a guy named Wilhelm Wundt. He was the first psychologist to really introduce it as any sort of science. So he was looking at experiments on basically how quickly could people respond to a stimuli, how quickly could they respond to something. And I don't think he really came across much, but it was at least a step towards actual, scientific psychology. And he actually had a couple students that kind of really also almost invented psychology. One known as Edward Titchener, the other known as William James. And they both had kind of somewhat different, but definitely important lines of thought and lines of work. So Titchener was all about kind of boiling things back to, simple perceptions or simple thought processes. And the way he did his research was to kind of think about things in terms of boiling them down to their most basic structure. And how he did his research was he would ask people to basically introspect and tell them how things were going on inside their mind and inside their brain. Obviously, there's problems with this, right? So just asking people to kind of tell you, how does your attention work? How does your memory work? Not really a reliable thing. And that's kind of the problem with this idea, is that it's totally open to interpretation, it's totally subjective, and people often don't know how things work. But it was kind of a better, one of Wundt's better students was actually William James. He came up with this idea of functionalism. What do you think functionalism means? Well, functionalism is, if you kind of got the hint from evolution, that we should try to trace all psychological ideas, all kind of behavioral or cognitive or social processes back to how they helped us evolve. So, as you're probably aware, remember, evolution is well accepted idea or concept that the more fit you are to survive, the more likely you are to survive. So if everyone is born with, if some people are born with some ability that makes them better candidates to survive and pass on their genes, that trait, whatever it might be, is going to become more common, right, amongst that species. So if some humans or a few humans have some better ability, something that gives them more ability to find food, that's going to make them more likely to survive and pass on their genes, and that's going to become a dominant trait you see in that species, or almost all of it. So William James kind of looked at this idea of evolution, or not idea, but theory, whatever you want to call it. It's not really theory. It's accepted. That's why I keep going back. But anyways, William James took evolution and applied it to psychology, right? So how can we explain different psychological concepts, processes, whatever it might be, in terms of their evolutionary value? How can we trace everything back to what they do to help us survive and function, hence functionalism. So does memory serve a purpose in terms of letting us remember where our food was or what areas to avoid, stuff like that. James actually had a bunch of his own students, such as Mary Hawkins, who's the first woman PhD and became APA, that's the American Psychological Association, the APA president. And also Stanley Hall, who actually founded the American Psychological Association. APA, they format a lot of stuff about how we write in psychology. They organize conferences, stuff like that. Okay, so researchers who explored how mental and behavioral processes enable humans to adapt, survive, flourish, were proponents of which early school of thought? I'm a water bottle, so I'm drinking out of a jug, in case you're wondering. Well, this would be functionalism, right? Because again, remember, functionalism is concerned with how do different mental and behavioral processes, how do they help us adapt and survive and pass on our genes, right? Yeah. Then came along Sigmund Freud. I mean, you gotta give him respect for, well, sorry, let me back up. So Sigmund Freud had a lot of really weird theories that not, in hindsight, don't seem to make a lot of sense. A lot of stuff about penises, I think incest, just weird stuff. So, but he did focus on a lot about how unconscious processes can contribute to how we think, how we behave. So he was pretty famous back in his time. And as we'll kind of see, his ideas, well, not so much his ideas, but the general notion of unconscious processes is certainly still a thing. He also had people like Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner, known as the behaviorists. So what these people were all about was basically observable behavior, not so much cognition. We'll kind of illustrate the difference in a minute. Pavlov, if you remember Pavlov's dog was all about kind of conditioning a response through behavior. So if I ring a bell, you'll cover this in the learning chapter, but kind of teach people to respond behaviorally to the sound of a bell. And Skinner was all about positively and negatively reinforcing behavior. So if you do a certain behavior, I can get you to do it or not do it in the future, depending on the response. If I give you a positive reinforcement, you're going to do it again. If I give you, some sort of discouragement, you're going to reduce that behavior. All about the behavior. We also had Carl Rogers, who was what we call a humanist. He was all about kind of stuff about how people kind of crave the need for acceptance and love and stuff like that. So just to kind of few takeaways to remember here, where psychology traces all the way back to ancient Greece. It's been shaped by many different fields, philosophy and biology, and to a certain degree it still is. One was kind of the big man to really establish it or try to establish it as a science. Whereas structuralism and functionalism were two of the early schools of thought. But not surprisingly, psychology has evolved a lot over time. So where are we now? Well, before we get there, let's talk a little bit about cognitive revolution. So this came about when we kind of realized that we couldn't explain, well, I wasn't alive then, so I shouldn't say we, but people kind of realized that not everything could be explained through pure behavior and through conditioning. And one of the biggest ones was actually that of language. So an early theory of language was that infants learn to speak through reinforcement. Basic idea is that when they say something correctly or identify it correctly using words, their parents or other people are going to give them encouragement. They're going to positively reinforce that behavior, right? But it sounds pretty good, right? But then people kind of realize that that doesn't actually make a ton of sense because, well, children actually say a lot of things that are never taught to them, that they never even hear, right? Another thing is that kids will even say things that are certainly not positively reinforced. They might say, "Mommy, I hate you," right? So if we're thinking about everything can be explained by conditioning, by you behave a certain way and it's either reinforced or discouraged, it doesn't make a lot of sense with language. And there's a few others, but the bottom line is that we started thinking that we can't explain everything through behavior. There has to be kind of this behind the scenes cognitive processes going on. And that's where the cognitive revolution came in. We started taking more of an interest in things like perception, processing, and remembering, not just behavior and discouragement or encouragement, but the actual cognitive processes that occur behind the scenes. Another thing that kind of came along that that's kind of still one of psychology's big questions, and always has been to a certain degree, is this idea of nature versus nurture. So nature versus nurture, something you probably heard before, just is, who we are, is our processes, whatever it might be. Is it a product of, our genetics, what we inherit, or is it a product of nurture? Is it a product of the environment we grew up in? So just as an example, let's say you're talking about, a really talented football player. Did they become a talented football player because of genetics, because of nature, or did they become a talented football player because of their environment that they grew up in? Plato used to argue that it was all about nature. Aristotle argued that it was all about nurture. Well, the answer to the debate and kind of where we're at today is it's of course going to be both, right? And it's all our behaviors, all our mental processes are definitely not one or the other. There's some things might be more heavily weighted in nature or nurture, but pretty much everything has at least some nature and some nurture to it, right? And that kind of makes sense, if you think about it, right? So again, with the example of a football player, I mean, there obviously is a genetic component to it. They need to be a certain size. They need to be naturally pretty athletic. But there's also nurture to it too as well, right? They need to grow up in an environment that encourages them to play football, that maybe allows them to work out, get in shape, whatever it might be. Right? So pretty much everything is going to have some nature and some nurture to it. A more modern kind of sensible question might be how much of it is nature versus nurture. Okay. So kind of another more modern approach to psychology is just kind of acknowledging that it's not going to be any one thing that's going to explain behavior or not going to explain the way we think. Right? And this is where the biopsychosocial model comes in. So what this model is saying is that there's basically three things that can contribute to how psychology works, right? Biology, psychology, and social aspects, right? So biology is, of course, more genetically based and more kind of on a simple brain level, what causes a certain behavior. Psychological might be more how you think, how you interpret things, and social might be how you're influenced by others, right? Or by your current situation. All these things can contribute, as you can see by the overlap. Kind of building off this is kind of what some of the fields of psychology or kind of approaches of psychology today. You have biological and more neuroscience-based approaches. You have evolutionary approaches. You have behavior and genetics. You have psychodynamics. It's still kind of a bit Freudian. Behavioral, cognitive, and sociocultural. So to kind of illustrate each of these, let's just think of an example. So if someone, say, has anger issues or they're prone to getting in a lot of fights, let's kind of approach how each of these fields might explain such a finding. Well, the biological approach might explain it by thinking about what exactly is going on in the brain. You know, is there a certain neurotransmitter, like we'll learn about later? Is there a certain brain area that is not functioning properly or functioning too much that's contributing to these frequent outbursts or starting fights or getting angry too easily? That's how the biological approach might explain frequent fighting or anger outbursts. The evolutionary approach might instead look at it in terms of, well, what's the evolutionary value of starting fights? Maybe if you go back to kind of caveman days, it wasn't really an option to, work things out with other people. It was all about, who was the best fighter. So maybe we've evolved to kind of be prone to start fights or whatever. That's how an evolutionary psychologist could explain such behavior. The behavior and genetics person might look at it in terms of, well, does this run in their family? Did their parents or grandparents, this person, have anger issues or have issues starting fights? Psychodynamic person might focus in terms of unconscious processes. So is there some sort of insecurity, some sort of, something that's going on outside the person's awareness that is causing them to do this behavior? Just while we're on the subject, like I said, Freud's theories about penises and stuff are kind of not really a thing anymore, but just basic ideas about things being outside of our awareness is definitely still relevant in pretty much any field, right? There's lots of stuff about what we call implicit or unconscious memory. So memory for things that you're not even aware you have, that's all totally legitimate. It's just the penises and the incest stuff is not too big these days. Anyways, the behavioral person, again, might think of this in terms of, well, what kind of behavior and then responses to that behavior might provoke this behavior. So maybe when they frequently behave in terms of starting fights, if everyone just backs down and it works out well for them, does that encourage this behavior? Cognitive person, again, focuses kind of on higher order functions. So is it an issue of how they interpret situations? Maybe they look at something that would not anger most people, but it really angers them because of the way they interpret it. Lastly, social cultural might focus on, okay, are they in a social environment or a culture that really encourages starting fights or getting angry? So kind of get the point. Each of these things kind of might have a different approach to explain the same behavior. So here's kind of what the world of psychology looks like in terms of an actual breakdown. You have clinical. Clinical focuses really on actual psychological illness, but not so much things like just, depression or anxiety or any kind of stuff like that, but actual things like schizophrenia, stuff like that. Counseling tends to focus more on stuff like, depression, dealing with something or self-esteem or something like that, or anxiety, kind of how to cope with those things. You have general psychology, developmental, that kind of obviously focuses on, we do have a chapter on this, how do people change over the years, and it kind of intersects with these other things. So how does people's social behavior, how does their cognitive abilities, how do those things change over the years? School and educational psychology obviously look at improving schooling environments or education, overlap a little bit with cognitive, because memory and thinking and stuff kind of goes hand in hand to a certain degree with educational. Social and personality, obviously look at how your personality is associated with different, behaviors or processes, and social kind of focuses on the influence of other people and interacting with other people. Cognitive, which is of course my field, focuses on things like memory, perception, attention, stuff like that. Thinking, processing, logic and reasoning, problem solving, stuff like that. Industrial organizational psych focuses on, kind of social psychology, but in an actual industrial setting. So how can we make our employees more efficient? How can we better improve our hiring processes? Stuff like that. I think you make some good money in IO psych. Biological and experimental kind of focus on the actual brain and how that links to different behaviors or cognitive processes. And then there's some other ones, like I think sports psychology, stuff like that. Okay. Another thing is you kind of have a bit of a difference between basic and applied research. So basic research is just about kind of understanding at the most basic level, how does something work? So why do we forget things? How do we choose what to attend and what not to attend? How does our vision work? It's just all about the theory and kind of explaining how things work. Applied research is more about, a specific applicable problem. So how can we get students to use better study strategies? What are better study strategies? Stuff like that. Do cell phones distract you when you drive? Stuff like that. And of course, it's not a dichotomy. These two kind of feed off each other, and there's all kinds of stuff in the middle. Counseling, psychology, clinical, and psychiatry are each a little bit different. Counseling can focus on stuff like anxiety, depression, and also, coping with stuff or any kind of personal issues, whereas clinical focuses on, I don't know what's the right term here, but other mental illnesses, something, I don't want to say more serious because all that stuff is of course serious, but something like, say, schizophrenia. And psychiatry is kind of a little bit of both, but you're actually a medical doctor as well, so you can prescribe medication. So Frank, here's a brief review for you. Frank is having a difficult time coping with the death of his partner. Who is most likely to help him with this? Clinical psychologist, a counseling psychologist, or psychiatrist, like Tom Brady? The answer, well, let's think about it for a second. The answer is B, counseling psychologist, right? Because this is kind of a personal issue. It's not something that needs to be medicated. It's not something like schizophrenia clinical psychology would deal with. Okay. So just some summary points. Remember, one of psychology's questions is always centers around nature and versus nurture. Biopsychosocial approach is a multifaceted approach to the study of behavior and mental processes. And psychology is a large discipline with many subfields. Okay, so moving on from there, let's talk a little bit about thinking critically within psychological science. All right, and kind of the need for research. So before we kind of go into that, let's just think about a couple of things. Why is psychology not just intuitive, right? Can't we just, explain things just kind of using our intuition and using logic? Why do we need actual psychological research? Well, let's take a couple example questions. Let's say someone rewards you for performing an interesting activity. So maybe they pay you money. You'll probably like that activity more. Is this true or false? So if you like something like, say, jogging, you're actually going to enjoy it more if someone pays you to do it. This is true. We'll come back to it. Another one, you should judge a book by its cover. Our first impressions of a potential partner's personality are often correct. I think that's true or false. We'll get the answers later. Another one, if you're feeling angry, the best thing to do is to blow off a little steam by venting some of your hostility. This reduces the chances that you will behave in a far more hostile or aggressive manner in the future. This one's actually false. Take a second and think about that. Very counterintuitive. Well, there's actually a reason for this. I think you talk about this in the social section. People tend to basically kind of rationalize things. So when you get paid for something, you actually, let me back up a minute. So if you go jogging just for no reason, well, forgetting, maybe just that it's good for you, you might kind of interpret that as, well, I'm going jogging because I like it. When someone actually pays you for it, you're more likely to enjoy it less. The reason is that you tend to, like I said, rationalize and think to yourself, if I'm getting paid for it, it must be because I don't want to do it, right? On the other hand, if you're not getting paid, you think to yourself, unconsciously often, I'm not getting paid for this, I don't need to be doing this, but I'm doing it anyways, it must be because I enjoy it. Contrast, when you do get paid for it, you think to yourself, well, maybe I don't enjoy this that much, but I am getting paid for it. That's why I'm doing it. It's the idea of cognitive dissonance. And there's a million studies to show that this is the case. Another one. This is actually true. You should, to a certain degree, judge a book by its cover. Your first impressions of a potential partner's personality are actually often correct. Again, very counterintuitive. And last one, if you're feeling angry, the best thing to do is to blow off a little steam. By venting some of your hostility, this reduces the chances that you'll behave in a far more hostile or aggressive manner in the future. This is actually, again, false, although it's very counterintuitive. Well, a few things and a few reasons why we did that. Like I said, a lot of psychology might seem intuitive. It's actually not. A lot of it is very counterintuitive. That's actually what I love about cognitive psychology and memory research, is that a lot of it is the exact opposite of what you would expect, right? You think, oh, certain things would go a certain way. And oftentimes they don't. Often it goes the opposite of what seems like common sense. So the bottom line here, and kind of what I want you to think about, is that we really can't rely on intuition to understand how we think. That's one reason. That's why we actually need kind of objective scientific evidence in psychology. Let's look at another example, though. So what I'm going to do here is, how can I best do this? Okay, if your name starts with A to M, go to the bathroom and come back in a couple minutes. If your name starts with N to Z, then read this and do the activity. Okay, studies have shown that students tend to perform better on exams when they dress in professional attire rather than comfortable clothes. Those are sweatpants. So people tend to do better when they dress well. Why do you think this might be the case? Try and think of a few reasons. I'm going to give a couple of reasons. Maybe it helps with the confidence, right? If you dress well, you look good, you think to yourself, you know what, I feel good, I'm relaxed, I'm going to do well on this test. Maybe it just also kind of puts you in the mood of, I don't know, like, this is serious, I'm going to take it seriously, I'm going to do well. Okay, the other people, A through M, can come back now. I just probably get messed up doing it online, it's fine. So A through M, think about this. Studies have shown that students tend to perform better on exams when they dress in comfortable clothes rather than professional attire. Why do you think that might be? I can think of a few reasons. Well, I can think of reasons. I mean, maybe if they're more comfortable, they're just more relaxed. You know, if you're wearing heels or a tie or whatever, that'd be kind of annoying. So dressing in comfortable clothes, maybe that just helps you be all more comfortable, right? And you can relax a little more and focus on the test. This is a concept known as hindsight bias. This example is meant to illustrate it. Good ideas seem very obvious after the fact. Something always seems obvious when you know it. So, for example, in this little demonstration, when I tell you studies have shown this, you're immediately going to jump to, well, yeah, that seems obvious. I can definitely come up with reasons why people do better when they dress well. Just like you can also do the same thing when I tell you the exact opposite. You can easily think of reasons why people would do well dressing comfortably. So it's easy to come up with something is always going to seem obvious after the fact, right? So that's true with psychology, right? It might seem obvious that, oh, you know, we don't use 10% of our brains, or, oh, it's obvious that after the fact that older people are actually less afraid of death. But going into it, it's not actually obvious at all. Here's another idea as to why we can't really use intuition to study psychology. How long do you think it would take to solve these anagrams? So the ones on your left, how long would it take to get the answers you see on your right? How about these ones? This is meant to illustrate another concept, general concept of overconfidence, right? So we're generally overconfident in our ability to predict things and understand them, right? So it might seem like, oh, you know, we could definitely do this in 30 seconds, but it actually takes a lot longer than that. Okay. And we often mistake this confidence for accuracy. So that's, again, another reason why it might seem like we can easily predict behavior, easily understand behavior, but that's not necessarily true. The last one is that we often want to make sense of the world we live in. And this results in something known as illusory correlations. What this means is that we tend to see patterns, we tend to see relationships that don't actually exist. So let me give you an example. If you have any kind of superstitions about, say, a sports team, like, oh, I always wear these certain socks when the Broncos are playing so that they'll win, you might get the impression like that actually changes it, right? Like the last couple times you wore those socks, they won, right? This would be an example of an illusory correlation, right? Seeing a relationship when none actually exists. Because we want to make sense of everything, we tend to see patterns that aren't actually there. So are the Broncos actually more likely to win when you wore those socks? Or was it just that you wore them like one time and the Broncos were playing a bad team? Who knows, right? Probably the second one. The bottom line is that this can, again, make it seem like we understand things we actually don't. So we might, again, just based on our intuition, think that, oh, I can, you know, explain what I'll predict, what personalities are associated with what behavior. But the problem is that we don't actually know, is that an illusory correlation or not? And that's why we need more objective kind of methods of testing. So, summarize, there's kind of three things that can lead us to overestimate our intuition. One being hindsight bias, being seeming obvious after the fact. The other one being overconfidence. The last one being a tendency to perceive patterns in random events, or illusory correlations. So that's why, in order to really see if an idea holds true, we need to test it empirically. That's where the actual scientific method comes in. And in this process, you start by asking a question, but the key here is that you transform it into a hypothesis, which means an actual testable prediction. So I have a theory about memory. How am I going to actually test that? How am I going to convert that into something observable? And that's where the challenge is. Of course, actually test the hypothesis and analyze your data, and then you report your findings. And that's what we'll talk about next lecture. Yeah. We'll stop there.